rusted hatch lay hidden beneath the forest leaves. When Daniel Price finally pried it open, the sight inside froze him in place. His blood turned cold. His breath caught in his chest. What lay below wasn't meant to be found. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Daniel Price, 58, retired park ranger and widower, thought the woods would remain his quiet refuge after his wife's passing. But the forest had other plans. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The forest Daniel Price walked each morning had always felt steady, almost eternal. The pines rose like cathedral pillars, their needles dripping with dew that clung to his boots as he moved along the old ranger path. The air carried that clean sharpness only autumn could bring, a scent of damp bark and faint smoke from distant chimneys. Squirrels darted through the underbrush, and the slow chatter of crows kept him company as the sun fought its way through a curtain of fog. It should have been an ordinary day. Daniel carried no rifle now, no ranger radio at his side, just the weight of his years and the silence of a man who had lost too much. Since his wife's passing, the forest had been his only refuge. Each morning, he rose before dawn, made a single cup of coffee, and set out across the trails they had once walked together. The quiet steadied him, gave him something no human words could. He paused at a clearing where the leaves had fallen thick, golden, and brittle underfoot. His breath came in slow, steady clouds as he adjusted his worn jacket and took in the sight. From above, the ground looked like any other patch of forest floor. But as he stepped forward, his boot struck something that was not wood nor stone, a hollow clink. Daniel crouched, pushing aside a tangle of moss and wet leaves. What emerged was the edge of a flat, rust-stained surface metal, hidden beneath the earth. He brushed at it with his palm, and the rough moss came away like a peeled scab. More of the surface appeared, smooth and cold even in the weak morning Sunday. His pulse quickened, though he forced himself to exhale and dismiss the rising unease. Probably just scrap, an old storm shutter, a car hood someone dumped decades ago. But even as he muttered the excuses aloud, his chest thudded with something deeper, stranger. I told myself, scrap doesn't hum inside your chest like this. The words rang in his mind as he stood back, scowling at the patch. The forest creaked around him with its usual patience, wind sighing through the treetops. But this one spot now felt different, separate, as though the ground itself was holding its breath. He shook his head and straightened, refusing to linger. Daniel had seen plenty of abandoned junk in his ranger days, broken appliances rusting out by creeks, hunters' old barrels left to rot, even the occasional storm shelter forgotten after families moved on. People left scars in the woods, and time buried them. That was all this was, he told himself, a scar. And yet, his hand lingered over the moss-stained edge a moment too long. He forced himself onward down the trail, boots snapping twigs, the sound louder than usual in the hush of the fog. A jay screamed overhead, its wings slicing the air, and Daniel winced at the sharpness. Normally, the forest noises comforted him. Today, they felt like interruptions, warnings. By the time he reached the stream that cut through the hollow, his breathing had steadied again. The water trickled over smooth stones, carrying the smell of damp earth and iron. Daniel crouched there, splashing the icy water against his face, as though washing away the thought of the hidden metal patch. He tried to push himself into the rhythm of his old habits, counting birdsong, reading tracks along the muddy bank, listening for distant woodpeckers. He even pulled a faded thermos from his pack and poured the last of his morning coffee, letting the steam rise into the cool air. It should have worked, but as he lifted the cup to his lips, a memory came. Sharp and sudden, his wife's voice, years ago on this same trail. Forests keep more secrets than people do, Danny. He had laughed at her then, shaking his head at her love for folklore. But now the words clung, sticky and heavy as cobwebs across his chest. Daniel packed up quickly, heading back toward his cabin. The fog had thickened, dulling the sun into a pale smudge. His boots found their way almost without thought, back along the ridges he had walked for decades. But his eyes kept sliding toward that patch of ground where the moss had been disturbed. He told himself not to look. He failed. From above, it looked like any other mound green, uneven, part of the forest floor. But now that he had uncovered its secret, it no longer blended in. The rust bled through in patches like sores under skin. He quickened his pace, telling himself he'd check again later. Maybe bring a shovel, maybe call the county to haul it off. But deep down, he knew he would do none of those things. Deep down, he wanted it covered again, forgotten, By the time he reached his cabin, the smell had followed him, faint but undeniable, a sharp chemical tang, unlike the earthy rot of wet leaves. It clung to his jacket. It seemed a ghost of the moss patch. He stripped the coat from his shoulders and hung it by the door, frowning as though that alone could remove the stench. Inside, the cabin was warm with the fire he had lit before leaving, the wooden beams crackling in rhythm with the settling of the logs. He sat at the table, hands around his empty thermos, staring at nothing. The forest had always been his comfort, a place of order, of natural law. But today, the order had cracked, and something unnatural waited beneath the moss. Daniel pushed back from the table, stood too quickly, and almost knocked over the chair. His reflection caught in the small window, pale and lined, eyes wide with something he had not felt in years. Fear. He clenched his fists, tried to steady himself. Just an old piece of metal, just a scrap buried by time, nothing more. But in the back of his mind, his wife's words echoed like a whisper carried by the fog. Forests keep more secrets than people do. Daniel turned away from the window, but the reflection of his wide eyes remained. And outside, though the wind stirred the trees, he swore the air itself carried a faint, chemical sweetness that did not belong. The faint smell lingered in the cabin, sharp and chemical, as if the forest's secret had followed him home. But soon, small details refused to stay hidden. The next morning dawned gray, the kind of pale light that blurred the edges of everything it touched. Daniel stepped outside with his mug of bitter coffee and scanned the tree line as he always did. Nothing seemed out of place. Pines swayed gently in the light wind. A woodpecker rattled at some distant trunk. Yet his gut carried the heaviness of something unfinished, as though the forest had left a sentence hanging. He tried to ignore it, walking his usual route toward the ridge. The trail was soft with frost, white crystals stretching like lace over fallen leaves. His boots cracked them as he moved, each step releasing earthy smells of rot and pine. Then, as the path curved toward the moss patch, he saw it. The frost was everywhere except there. The entire forest floor glittered pale and brittle, but the mound where he had scraped the moss yesterday was dark, wet, thawed. The metal beneath it glistened faintly as though it had been warmed from within. Daniel stopped dead. A crow shrieked overhead, startling him into a half-step back. His hand trembled around the coffee mug, and for a moment he nearly dropped it. Don't do this. Don't start imagining things. Still, his eyes refused to leave that patch. He stepped closer, kneeling despite himself. He laid a gloved hand on the exposed edge of metal. Even through the leather, it felt wrong, colder than frost, like ice drawn straight from a cellar. His breath misted over it. The vapor didn't settle. Instead, it slid along the surface as though the metal repelled it. He pulled his hand away quickly, shaking his head. Old scrap, that's all. But in the back of his mind, another voice intruded, steady and certain. Metal doesn't stay warm when everything else freezes, and frost doesn't melt in just one place. The thought snagged at him, pulling up old memories. Back when he was a ranger, he had seen all kinds of strange dumps, places where hunters buried cans of gasoline, where survivalists hid gear, even where moonshiners sank barrels deep into the soil. Those places always looked wrong in some small way. A patch of earth too soft, frost thawing too soon, smells that didn't belong, and now, here it was again. Daniel rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw, fighting the knot in his chest. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to leave the mound, pretend it was just rusting junk. He even said it aloud, voice cracked and low. Nothing but trash. But the words fell flat, unconvincing even to himself. This time, it wasn't denial he knew what it meant, but he shoved the truth deep into the soil of his mind. He forced his feet to turn back to the trail, forced himself to breathe evenly, to move forward as if nothing had changed. His boots thudded against the frozen earth, the sound too sharp, echoing faintly in the hollow. But he hadn't gone 10 paces before curiosity dragged his eyes back. The mound seemed to watch him. He had the strange, irrational impression that if he turned his back too long, it might open on its own. The idea tightened his chest, and he cursed under his breath, gripping his mug until the ceramic burned against his palm. When he finally tore himself away, he walked faster, heart hammering as though chased. The rest of the forest tried to play its part in being ordinary. Squirrels skittered through the branches. The stream chattered over stones. A red-tailed hawk wheeled above the ridge. But Daniel felt none of the comfort these signs used to bring. Instead, every sound seemed sharp, intrusive, layered with something else beneath it. It was only later, as he cut back toward the cabin, that he heard it for the first time. A faint, hollow echo. Daniel had paused near the moss patch again, though he had sworn not to. He lifted the mug and rapped it against the metal edge, just once, telling himself it would prove how solid and ordinary the thing was. The sound that came back didn't belong. It wasn't the dull thud of earth-packed scrap. It was a hollow ring, a metallic reverberation that carried downward, down, and down, and down, as though the soil beneath his boots was only a thin skin stretched over some enormous cavity. Daniel froze, breath stuck in his throat. The echo went on far longer than it should have, as if the forest floor itself had become an empty drum. He glanced at the trees, half expecting the noise to have startled birds into flight. But the woods had gone silent. Not a wing beat, not a chirp. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting. The silence pressed against him harder than the sound had. For a long moment, he stood motionless, the mug still in his hand, the cold seeping through his gloves into his bones. His heart banged against his ribs in a rhythm that matched the echo fading below. Finally, he stepped back, stumbling slightly as his boot caught on a root. He whispered again, but this time his voice shook. "Just trash." The words rang hollow, and then just as he turned away, the metal gave the faintest creak, like a door shifting on its hinge, before falling silent again. The ground beneath the hatch seemed to breathe, each echo rising from the dark like something alive, waiting for him to come closer. By now, denial was no longer enough. Daniel tried to keep to his routine, but the forest wasn't cooperating. Every step along the ridge felt heavier than it had a week before. The air seemed thicker, almost oily, and the usual chatter of birds had thinned to nothing near the mound. He noticed the details first. The soil around the patch had hardened unnaturally, the way ground gets when fire bakes it from below. His boot heels struck against it with a dull, resistant thud, unlike the softer earth everywhere else. He crouched again, brushing at the moss with his calloused fingers. His gloves scraped across grooves in the metal scratches, etched in different directions, too precise to be roots or weather. The fog had settled lower, clinging to the earth, and as he leaned close, the cold vapor curled around his face with the sting of ammonia. His throat tightened. He coughed, then stood abruptly, eyes watering. The smell was sharper than yesterday, stronger. Not just metal, not just rust. Daniel turned sharply at the sound of crunching leaves. A figure approached along the tree line, tall, broad-shouldered, with a hunter's gait. It was Jack Whitmore, his neighbor from down the road, carrying a shotgun slung casually over one shoulder. Jack had the kind of expression that never gave much away sun-creased eyes, a half-smile that could mean friendliness or warning. "Morning, Danny," Jack called, voice carrying in the cold air. "Didn't figure you'd be out this early." Daniel tried to sound casual. Old habits. The woods don't wait for anyone. Jack nodded, scanning the ground. His eyes landed on the disturbed moss, the faint outline of rust beneath. He let out a short whistle. "Well now," he said slowly. "Looks like you've been digging where no one else should." Daniel's stomach tightened. The words were offhand, maybe even joking, but the way Jack said them made Daniel hear something else, something sharper. The way he said it coiled in my stomach, less a remark, more a warning whispered through his teeth. He forced a chuckle. "Just scrap. Nothing worth a second glance." Jack's eyes lingered longer than Daniel liked. Then he shrugged, shifting the shotgun. "Maybe so. Still, sometimes it's better not to pull at the forest's stitches. Never know what comes unraveled." With that, Jack tipped his cap and walked on, vanishing into the fog. Daniel stood frozen, watching the man disappear between the pines. His pulse refused to calm. He replayed the words in his mind. Better not to pull at the forest stitches. Was that a neighbor's casual wisdom, or a warning not to pry further? He turned back to the mound. The fog swirled across it, thicker now, as if clinging to that single spot. Daniel reached for the ground again, pressing his palm flat. The soil felt tight, compressed, like concrete disguised as earth. The memory of Jack's voice stuck in his ears, whispering alongside his wife's older words. Forests keep more secrets than people do. Daniel grabbed a small branch and poked at the seams. The wood snapped against the surface, brittle and useless. He tossed it aside, muttering curses under his breath. His jaw ached from how tightly he had been clenching it. The silence around him pressed harder than the fog. Then the rain began. At first a fine drizzle, speckling his jacket, then heavier, pattering through the trees, dripping onto the mound. Water gathered in shallow puddles across the moss, shimmering dark in the gray light. Daniel leaned closer, ready to turn away again. That was when he saw it. The water didn't stay. Instead of soaking into soil or running down toward the slope, every drop slid toward the cracks in the moss, seeping directly into the hidden seam. The puddles drained unnaturally fast, like liquid vanishing down a throat. Daniel stumbled back, heart punching against his ribs. He wiped rain from his forehead, but it wasn't the weather that chilled him. It was the sight of earth swallowing water that should have pooled harmlessly. The mound seemed to drink, and when it did, the chemical odor grew stronger, a sharp tang flooding the clearing until his eyes burned. He coughed again, clutching at his chest, vision blurring. He spun toward the tree line, desperate for air, but the fog seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. Daniel staggered backward, boots slipping in the wet leaves, until he tripped against a fallen log and sat hard, gasping. His hands shook as he wiped his face. His coffee mug had fallen somewhere along the ground, rolling until it clinked softly against the metal edge. The sound echoed, not just downward this time, but outward. The ground seemed to sigh, long and low, as if the mound had been holding its breath and was now exhaling. Daniel froze, drenched in rain, his heartbeat drumming against his skull. The soil shifted beneath his boots, just slightly, as though the earth itself had stirred, and the hatch was no longer asleep. That morning, the ground itself seemed alive. Daniel hadn't slept. He had lain awake through the storm, listening to the faint groans drifting from the forest, each one slipping between the walls of his cabin. By dawn, he gave up pretending to rest. He pulled on his jacket, grabbed the old spade he had once used for fence posts, and stepped into the dripping silence of the woods. The rain had stopped, but everything dripped. Branches released fat drops onto his shoulders. Mud sucked at his boots. Mist curled low over the ground, blurring the edges of the trees until the whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. He reached the mound. The moss looked swollen, slick with rain, but the seams of rust showed wider now. Water had drained cleanly away, leaving the exposed patch dark and gleaming. The smell rose sharp in the cold air, not like rot, but like chemicals, uncapped, bitter, sour, biting the inside of his nostrils. Daniel pressed the spade into the earth. The soil resisted, hard, compact, as if packed deliberately. He drove the blade harder, grunting, feeling the jarring shock through his arms. At last, the dirt began to peel back in chunks, revealing more of the metal beneath. With each scrape, his pulse grew louder. The shape emerged slowly, a square edge, straight and purposeful, too precise to be natural. The more he cleared, the more it resembled a hatch, its outline traced in rust, its surface scarred with scratches like fingernails dragged across iron. He stepped back, chest heaving, spade trembling in his grip. The hatch stared back at him like a sealed eye. His wife's words echoed, faint but insistent. Forests keep more secrets than people do. Daniel wiped rain from his face, then crouched. Hooking the spade under the seam, he pressed down with all his weight. At first, nothing moved. Then, with a long, tearing groan, the metal shifted. The sound shot through the clearing, deep and hollow, making his teeth ache. The hatch lifted an inch. A puff of air burst upward, damp and sour, carrying with it the sting of rust and something older, sharper chemical fumes that burned his throat. He staggered back, coughing, covering his mouth with his sleeve. The fog swirled thicker as if drawn toward the opening. Daniel gritted his teeth and shoved again, muscles straining until the hinges gave way with a violent screech. The hatch slammed against the earth, revealing a dark mouth cut into the ground. He stood over it, trembling. A ladder descended into shadow, its rungs slick with rust, vanishing into black. The air that rose from below was heavy, metallic, soaked with damp concrete, and something else, something acrid, unnatural, that clung to his tongue. Daniel's stomach turned, but his eyes adjusted, catching shapes in the dark. The first thing he saw was paint, letters, stenciled in fading white across the concrete wall just below the hatch. They spelled only fragments, but he recognized the style immediately. Military. Block capitals. His knees weakened. The second thing caught the light in a sudden glint. A mask. It hung by one strap on the top rung of the ladder, its glass eyes clouded, its rubber mouth warped with age. A gas mask. Daniel froze, his breath locking in his chest. He could almost imagine it breathing without him, its lenses staring blankly upward, its black mouth gaping like something waiting to feed. He gripped the rim of the hatch, knuckles white. His thoughts crashed together in jagged fragments. Why here? Why buried? Who left this? The answer, his mind whispered, was worse than ignorance. Someone hid this on purpose. Daniel staggered back, boots sliding in the mud. His pulse pounded against his temples. He wanted to slam the hatch closed, to bury it again, to pretend he had never touched it. Yet some part of him couldn't move, couldn't leave. Curiosity and fear clashed in his chest like two animals tearing at each other. His wife's voice returned, gentler this time, almost like a warning prayer. Forests keep more secrets than people do. He whispered to the empty trees, his voice barely audible. And some secrets should stay that way. But he did not close the hatch. Instead, he stared into the dark, the ladder yawning down into silence, the stenciled letters half hidden, the gas mask swaying slightly in the draft. The forest around him had gone silent again, as if the world itself was waiting for what he would do next. Daniel's stomach turned violently, and he stepped back further. His hands shook, his throat burned with the chemical air, his entire body screamed to run, and yet he could not stop looking. The hatch gaped before him, a wound in the earth, and Daniel realized with sudden terror that whatever lay below hadn't been disturbed in decades until now. But the discovery refused to stay buried. Daniel shut the hatch, or at least he thought he did. The hinges screamed, the lid slammed, but even as the moss-covered metal sealed again, he felt as though the earth had only closed one eye while the other remained open. By the time he reached his cabin, the fog had thickened into a pale wall. His boots dripped on the porch. His hands shook so badly he had to try twice before he fit the key into the lock. When he finally stepped inside, the air felt different, close, heavy, tainted by a faint, chemical tang that didn't belong. He slammed the door and slid the bolt, then leaned against it, chest heaving. His jacket clung damp to his skin. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting the room in a restless glow. He poured himself tea, 2 bags steeped strong, the way his wife had made it when his ranger shifts dragged long into cold nights. He cradled the mug at the table, staring at the framed photo that rested there. Her smile, caught years earlier in a burst of sunlight at the edge of this very forest, met him with quiet patience. "I should have left it," Daniel muttered. His voice cracked. "Should have left it under the moss." The tea tasted bitter, metallic, as though the smell from the woods had seeped into the water itself. He spat it into the sink, his hands gripping the counter until his knuckles whitened. Silence pressed against the cabin. Then, thump, Daniel froze. The sound was distant but clear, a deep, deliberate impact that carried through the ground. He felt it faintly in his boots, as though something massive had shifted below the soil. He forced himself to breathe, telling himself it was nothing, just the forest settling, a branch falling. But then it came again. Thump. This time, his teacup rattled against the saucer. A ripple moved across the surface of the liquid like a pulse. His chest clenched. If the sound seeped through my walls, then even home was no refuge. He set the cup down carefully, afraid it might shatter in his hands. The fire crackled, but the warmth no longer touched him. He moved slowly to the window, pulling aside the curtain with trembling fingers. Fog pressed close to the glass. Beyond it, the outlines of trees blurred into ghostly shadows. Nothing moved, but the silence was too complete, like the woods themselves had stopped breathing. Then came the groan, low, rolling, deep enough to vibrate the floorboards. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't thunder. It was the same sound the hatch had made when he pried it open, only louder, stretched across the night. Daniel staggered back, his pulse racing. The photo frame toppled from the table, clattering to the floor. He crouched to pick it up, clutching it to his chest as though it might shield him. He remembered nights during his ranger years when storms ripped through the valley, when trees cracked like gunfire and rivers roared out of their banks. But nothing in all those years had carried this weight, this presence. It wasn't just sound, it was intent. Daniel pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, whispering to the empty fog, "Leave me alone. Leave me be." The woods did not answer. He stoked the fire, threw another log on just to hear something human. The flames snapped bright, scattering shadows across the walls. For a moment, the crackle of wood gave him a rhythm to cling to. His breathing slowed, his shoulders lowered. But then, as the log settled, the sound returned. Thump, this time closer. The lamp on the shelf quivered. The cup rattled again, sliding an inch across the table. Daniel's hands shook so hard the photo slipped from his grip. His wife's smile looked up at him from the rug, and his throat burned. He sank into the chair, elbows on his knees, pressing both palms against his face. His mind spun. What was down there? Why bury it? Why here? Explanations circled like wolves. Military waste? Some old bunker? Something dumped after the war? But no explanation accounted for the sounds, the smells, the way the frost melted only there. No explanation calmed the pounding in his chest. He stayed at the table for hours, the fire burning low, the fog thickening outside. His head drooped forward once, twice, but each time the faint groan rose again, vibrating through the cabin until his teeth clenched. By dawn, he had not slept a minute. His eyes burned. His hands ached from gripping the chair. The forest outside was silent again, as though nothing had happened, but the silence no longer comforted him. It felt like waiting. Daniel rose unsteadily, setting the photo back on the table, his hand lingering on the glass. His wife's eyes seemed to watch him, calm but unreadable. He whispered, "I'm sorry. I can't stop hearing it." When he stepped onto the porch, the morning air slapped cold against his face. He scanned the fog-bound trees, every nerve on edge. The path toward the hatch waited, darker than it had ever looked before. And though his body ached with exhaustion, Daniel felt the truth in his bones. The discovery hadn't stayed in the forest. It had followed him home. As he turned to re-enter the cabin, the floorboards trembled under his boots, one last groan rolling out from the woods, deeper than before, as though the hatch was calling his name. By morning, he was no longer the only one who noticed. Daniel trudged into town with circles under his eyes, his boots heavy with mud. He hadn't planned to speak to anyone. He wanted only supplies, kerosene, more tea, maybe lumber to reinforce his door. But in a small town, showing your face was enough to invite questions. At the diner, voices hushed when he walked in. The room smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee, the usual comfort drowned out by the weight of watching eyes. "Morning, Danny," the waitress said, her smile quick but uneasy. "Rough night?" Daniel only nodded, sliding into a corner booth. His ears caught the whispers almost at once. Something out on his land. Fog thicker down that way. Kids say the ground hums. He clenched his jaw and stirred his coffee. He wanted to snap at them, to tell them it was nothing, but that would mean admitting there was something to deny. By noon, when he headed back toward his cabin, he realized the rumors had spread faster than he had guessed. A group of teenagers had already made their way up the ridge, their laughter cutting through the trees. They carried flashlights despite the daylight, daring each other closer to the moss patch. Daniel shouted, his voice raw, "Get away from there!" The kids scattered at once, their footsteps pounding down the trail. One dropped a candy wrapper that fluttered to the ground like a surrender flag. Daniel's chest heaved as he approached the hatch. The moss looked torn wider, the metal more exposed, and the smell stronger now, sharper, carrying that chemical sting that made his throat close. Motif 2, the smell escalating. He crouched, pressing his palm to the soil. It felt warm, as though something below had stirred since the night. Leaves rustled behind him. Daniel spun, his pulse leaping. It was Jack Whitmore again, moving with that slow hunter's gait, shotgun cradled loosely, but his eyes sharp. "You're not the only one," Jack said, voice low. Daniel frowned. "Not the only one, what?" Jack tilted his head toward the mound. "Heard it last night. Carried clean across the valley. My dogs wouldn't stop barking till morning." Daniel swallowed hard, searching the man's weathered face for mockery. There was none. Before he could answer, another figure appeared, a thin silhouette in a black coat, moving slower than Jack. It was Mrs. Keller, the widow who lived 2 cabins over. She clutched her shawl against the wind, eyes fixed on the mound. Her voice cracked like brittle wood. "The earth only swallows what heaven rejects." Daniel shivered. Her words hung in the damp air like scripture spoken at a graveside. Jack scoffed, though the sound lacked humor. "Don't start that again, Clara. It's just old metal." But Daniel caught the way his neighbor's grip tightened on the shotgun. Mrs. Keller's gaze shifted to Daniel, sharp despite her age. "Some things aren't meant to be uncovered. You hear it, don't you? Beneath the soil." Daniel tried to deny it, but the words jammed in his throat. He looked away, staring at the rusted seam. Mrs. Keller spat into the leaves and turned, muttering prayers under her breath as she disappeared into the fog. The silence between the 2 men was heavier than before. Daniel finally spoke. "It's not just junk. You know that." Jack didn't answer. He only adjusted his shotgun and walked off the other direction, his figure swallowed by mist. Daniel stayed alone at the hatch, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill. The chemical odor burned sharper, making his stomach churn. He pressed a hand against his chest, forcing slow breaths. Then it came, faint at first, but unmistakable. Movement below. Not the hollow echo of yesterday, not the shifting of soil. Something else, a scrape, a shuffle, like weight shifting against metal deep underground. Daniel froze, every muscle locked. He held his breath, ears straining. The sound came again, longer this time. Something dragging, something alive. He stumbled back, boot sliding in the mud. His heart thundered in his chest. For a moment, he thought he saw the hatch itself quiver, the moss trembling as though stirred by breath rising from below. He ran then, stumbling up the path toward his cabin, his lungs burning. The forest seemed to tilt around him, the fog thickening until every tree looked the same. His boots pounded against the earth, but the sound from below seemed to follow, rising in time with his heartbeat. When he finally reached the cabin porch, he turned back. The forest stood still, gray and silent. But in the distance, faint through the fog, he thought he saw the hatch shudder once, like a chest rising, falling, waiting. The ground beneath the hatch was no longer still. Something below had begun to move. The secret was no longer his alone. By the next day, Daniel knew the hatch had become a spectacle. Flashlights flickered across the ridge at night, and voices carried in the fog. Some came out of curiosity, others on dares. He spotted groups of teenagers sneaking toward the clearing, their laughter brittle and high. Men from the diner trailed behind them with cans of beer, whispering like they were on a hunting trip. Daniel tried to chase them off, but the forest had stopped listening to him. Every time he shouted, the voices only carried further, bouncing from tree to tree. The hatch had become the town's secret, not his. At the hardware store that morning, he overheard the gossip plane. Storm shelter, maybe. Treasure from bootleggers. Old government dump. Each version carried more weight than the last. By evening, people weren't whispering anymore. They were arguing, speculating, drawing their own maps of his land on diner napkins. Daniel's stomach churned. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. When he got back to the ridge, the crowd was already thinning, but the damage was done. The moss was torn wider, the soil trampled with dozens of prints. A crushed soda can sat at the hatch's edge, as though mocking him. Daniel bent to pick it up when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel behind him. A county cruiser rolled into the clearing, lights off but unmistakable in the dim fog. Sheriff Cole stepped out, a broad man with a lined face and a voice that always tried too hard to sound calm. His deputy trailed behind with a flashlight. "Evening, Daniel," Cole said, resting his thumbs in his belt. "Been hearing chatter about some odd find on your property." Daniel's throat tightened. "It's nothing, just rusted metal." Cole walked closer, the gravel crunching under his boots. His deputy swung the light across the hatch, the beam catching the wet rust. "Storm shelter, maybe," Cole offered. His tone was casual, almost too casual. Lots of folks built them back in the day, dug 'em deep, and forgot about 'em once the panic passed. Daniel studied the sheriff's face. The man's voice carried confidence, but his hands betrayed him. His right hand lingered on the rim of the hatch. I saw his hands grip the hatch tighter than he meant to show. Daniel's breath quickened. He whispered, "It's not just metal down there." Cole's eyes flicked up at him, then back down. For a moment, the sheriff's calm cracked, a shadow flashing across his face. Then it was gone, replaced with his steady drawl. "Tell you what," Cole said, "we'll come back tomorrow. Bring some tools, maybe a scanner. Just routine. Nothing for you to worry about." Daniel wanted to argue, to shout, to demand he take it seriously, but his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He only nodded, fists clenched tight in his pockets. The sheriff and his deputy lingered a moment longer, their boots muddying the ground around the hatch. Then Cole tipped his hat, climbed back into the cruiser, and drove off, taillights swallowed by the fog. Daniel stood alone again, the hatch yawning like a wound at his feet. The night crept in colder. He swore the fog grew thicker around the clearing, curling tighter against the ground as if drawn to the metal. The smell lingered, bitter and chemical, burning the back of his throat. He staggered back to the cabin, his boots dragging, his mind spinning with questions he didn't want answered. That night he lay awake again, listening. Every so often, the ground groaned. Sometimes faint, sometimes so sharp the glass on his shelf trembled. Each time, Daniel jolted upright, heart pounding. By dawn, exhaustion weighed on him heavier than his own bones. When the knock came at his door, he already knew who it was. Sheriff Cole stood there with 2 deputies and a pair of men Daniel didn't recognize. They carried equipment, metal cases, long poles, scanners that blinked faint green. Cole's smile was practiced. "Told you I'd be back." Daniel's chest tightened as he watched them unload. He whispered to himself, but the words gave him no comfort. "It's not mine anymore. It's theirs." The men set their tools by the hatch, and Daniel realized the secret he had tried to bury was now in the hands of strangers. Tomorrow, the whole town would know. Now, the law stood at his fence line. By the time Daniel returned from town that evening, the ridge was no longer his. Floodlights glared through the fog, mounted on tripods that bathed the clearing in a sterile glow. Sheriff Cole's cruiser sat crooked on the trail, doors open, radios buzzing with low static. Deputies milled around, their boots leaving sharp new scars in the mud. Daniel stopped short, heart hammering. His land looked less like a patch of forest and more like a crime scene. "Evening, Mr. Price," one deputy called, though the tone was anything but friendly. Cole himself stood near the hatch, hands on his hips, a cigarette glowing in his mouth. He exhaled smoke through the mist and gave Daniel a curt nod. "Like I promised," Cole said. "We're just having a look." Daniel's voice cracked as he stepped closer. "It isn't safe. You shouldn't be opening it." Cole's eyes narrowed. "Safe or not, it's county business now." Daniel opened his mouth, then shut it again. The words knotted in his chest. He turned his gaze instead to the hatch. Its edges gleamed under the floodlights, slick with dew, the moss torn wider than before. The seam gaped just enough to breathe a faint chemical odor that carried across the clearing. Even the deputies muttered about the stench, though they kept working. One of the strangers, an older man in a gray jacket, knelt with a handheld scanner. Its antenna hummed softly, a green light blinking as he swept it over the metal. The sound made Daniel's teeth ache. Another deputy lowered a microphone down on a cord. For a moment, nothing but static filled the clearing. Then faint, deep came a groan, long and metallic, rising from below. The deputies shifted uneasily. One muttered, "Hell of an echo." Cole scowled, pretending calm. Just settling steel. Nothing unusual. But Daniel saw the twitch at the corner of his jaw. He stepped forward, voice hoarse. "You hear that? You know that's no echo." Cole's eyes cut toward him, cold. "Go back to your cabin, Daniel. Let us do our job." Daniel clenched his fists. He wanted to fight, to shove past them, to scream. But the floodlights blinded him, and the weight of authority pressed too heavy. He backed away, retreating to the edge of the trees. From there, he watched. The men whispered among themselves as they adjusted their equipment. One deputy muttered too loudly, and Daniel caught the words, "Classified? You didn't hear that from me." His stomach sank. Classified. The word buzzed in his skull like a hornet. By evening, the town itself seemed to hum with rumors. Daniel stopped at the gas station for kerosene, and even there the attendant leaned across the counter. "Truth, they found a bunker out there?" the man asked. "Government kind? Folks saying Cold War. Folks saying worse." Daniel's throat tightened. He shook his head, muttered something about nonsense, and fled with his purchase. But as he drove back, every porch light he passed flickered on, neighbors watching, waiting. By the time he reached the ridge again, a small crowd had gathered at the fence line the deputies had hastily strung with tape. Men, women, even children peered through the fog toward the glowing floodlights. Daniel pushed past them, his boots dragging, but every step felt heavier. His land wasn't his anymore. It belonged to their stares, their whispers, their hungry speculation. At the hatch, Cole was speaking into his radio, voice low and clipped. The gray-jacketed man shook his head, scanning again and again as though the results refused to settle. Daniel stood at the tree line, unseen, watching. The fog thickened, curling around the lights until the beams looked like pale swords stabbing upward. The hatch itself gleamed wet, a dark mouth just waiting to open. And Daniel, powerless, felt smaller than he had in years. As midnight neared, the deputies lowered a scanner deeper into the hatch, and the readout on the screen spiked so suddenly that even Sheriff Cole's practiced calm broke. He swore under his breath, snapped the radio off, and ordered the lights cut. The clearing plunged into darkness. What the experts saw made their faces turn pale. The next morning, Daniel woke to the rumble of engines. He stepped onto his porch, squinting into the gray light, and saw them. Trucks climbing the ridge, wheels grinding mud. More cruisers. More strangers in plain jackets with cases of gear. The forest that once sheltered him now trembled with intrusion. By the time he reached the clearing, the place had transformed. The floodlights were back, brighter than ever. A tent had been erected. Tables lined with equipment blinked green and red. Deputies guarded the taped perimeter, while townsfolk gathered in clusters just beyond, whispering like churchgoers before a sermon. The hatch gaped open. Sheriff Cole stood beside it, his arms folded, jaw tight. Beside him, the gray-jacketed man from the night before leaned over the rim, speaking in clipped tones to another specialist below. Daniel's stomach turned. The air reeked stronger than before, a chemical sting mixed with the metallic bite of rust. He pressed a sleeve to his face, but the odor clung to his tongue, sour and alive. Cole's voice cut through. "We're going in." The words struck Daniel harder than any shout. He stumbled forward, only to be blocked by a deputy's hand. "This is my land," Daniel snapped. "You don't know what you're opening." The deputy's grip tightened. "Step back, sir." Daniel's chest heaved, but he knew resistance meant nothing now. He backed away, eyes locked on the hatch. The ladder groaned as the first man descended, then another. Their helmets glinted under the floodlights. Each step echoed upward, hollow, as if the earth itself had become a drum. For long minutes, nothing. The crowd pressed closer to the tape, whispering. Even Jack Whitmore was there, shotgun absent but eyes sharp. Mrs. Keller stood further back, shawl clutched tight, lips moving in silent prayer. Then the radio crackled. A voice from below, tight with disbelief. "You'd better see this." The gray-jacketed man and Sheriff Cole exchanged a glance. Then they too descended, boots clanging against rusted rungs. Daniel's nails dug into his palms. He wanted to follow, needed to see, but the deputy blocked him still. Minutes passed. The crowd murmured louder. Children fidgeted. The fog pressed close, muffling every sound except the faint buzz of radios. Finally, Cole's voice rose from the dark, strained. "Bring up the first crate." The ladder rattled. 2 men emerged, their faces pale, hauling a long wooden box between them. Its surface was scarred, stenciled with black letters, half faded. Daniel's gut twisted as he recognized the style. Military, Cold War, vintage. The men set it on the mud. One pried it open with a crowbar. The wood splintered, groaned, then revealed rows of sealed canisters, each marked with faded hazard symbols. The crowd gasped. Mothers clutched their children. Jack muttered something under his breath. Mrs. Keller turned her face away, whispering faster. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. His ranger years returned in a rush, training drills, warnings about old munitions, chemical waste. But never like this, never hidden beneath his land. Another box came up. This one smaller, metal, its latch still locked. Cole himself cracked it open. Inside lay stacks of papers, sealed plastic sleeves, each page stamped classified. The sheriff's face drained of color. He snapped the lid shut, barking orders. Deputies moved fast, stringing new tape, pushing the crowd further back. But Daniel saw his eyes when he looked up, saw the fear he tried to mask. The gray-jacketed man climbed out next, shaking his head. His voice carried, despite the hush. This was never supposed to be found. The words cut through the fog like a blade. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters who had slipped in began scribbling furiously. A camera clicked. Voices rose, accusations, demands, speculation. Daniel staggered back. The ground seemed to tilt beneath him. His forest, his land, his last refuge had become a stage. And he, the man who found it, stood exposed, a target under the weight of every staring eye. The air thickened with tension, the chemical odor burning sharper as though rising in protest. Daniel pressed a hand to his chest, his breath ragged. His wife's voice echoed again. "Forests keep more secrets than people do." He whispered back, broken. "And this one's too big to bury." The chaos swelled. Deputies shouted, reporters shoved. Children cried. Cole tried to regain order, but his own voice faltered. The hatch yawned behind him, darker than ever, as though the earth itself disapproved of being opened. Daniel locked eyes with the sheriff, and for the first time he saw not authority but a man cornered by something bigger than both of them. By nightfall, the whole town was talking. The news spread faster than wildfire. By the time the sun dipped, vans with satellite dishes crowded the 2-lane road. Reporters leaned against their cars, rehearsing lines. Photographers jostled for space along the tape. Even neighbors who had never spoken to Daniel in years came trudging up the ridge, whispering and pointing as though his land were a roadside attraction. Daniel stood on his porch, watching the glow of floodlights flicker through the trees. His forest, once quiet enough to hear a squirrel scratch bark, now pulsed with the hum of generators and the murmur of dozens of voices. When he walked down to the clearing, the sight nearly broke him. The hatch was surrounded. Deputies barked orders at gawkers. Reporters shouted questions across the tape. "Mr. Price, when did you first find it? Did you know there was a government facility here? Are you worried about contamination?" Flashes blinded him. He shielded his face, heart pounding. The smell hung heavy in the damp night, sharper with every hour, as though the very act of unearthing the hatch had awakened it. Jack Whitmore pushed through the crowd, jaw set, his voice low near Daniel's ear. "They'll never leave now. You should have kept your mouth shut." Daniel turned on him, raw and hoarse. "I didn't invite this." Jack only shook his head and melted back into the crowd, leaving the words like a bruise. Inside the tape, Sheriff Cole paced, issuing clipped commands. But even his deputies looked uncertain. The crates had been hauled into a tent. The classified papers vanished into black cases. Scientists or men posing as them spoke in whispers, too quiet for the crowd to hear. Daniel strained to catch fragments. Hazard levels unstable. Containment priority. Orders from higher up. Each fragment only hollowed him further. He backed away, shoving through the onlookers until he reached the far side of the clearing. There, a single object caught his eye. His wife's photo. He had carried it earlier, a habit whenever the forest turned heavy. But now it lay in the mud, jostled from his jacket pocket by the crowd. Her smile was smudged with rain, the frame streaked with dirt. Daniel crouched, reaching instinctively. But this time, he stopped. His hand hovered an inch above the glass. His breath shook. Then he let it sink deeper into the mud, swallowed slowly by the churned earth. His wife's photo slipped into the mud, and for the first time, I let it sink like she, too, was being swallowed by the secret. The sting in his chest cut sharper than the chemical air. When he rose, the scene before him blurred into chaos. Reporters climbing the tape, deputies shoving them back. Voices overlapping, questions shouted, orders snapped. A flare popped bright red, painting the fog blood-colored. Cole roared for order, but his voice broke in the clamor. And still the hatch gaped, patient, unblinking. Daniel felt something shift beneath his boots. Just faint. A tremor, as though the ground itself bristled under the weight of so many strangers stomping above it. He whispered, unheard in the noise, "You shouldn't have come here." The tremor grew sharper, a vibration felt more in the chest than in the soil. People stumbled, shouting. Someone screamed. The scientists snapped their cases shut. Deputies tightened their grips on weapons. For a moment, panic teetered at the edge. Then Cole snapped into his radio, barked a command, and men unfurled massive tarps from the trucks. They dragged them across the clearing, pinning them over the hatch. The heavy sheets fell, weighted at the corners, swallowing the glow of the floodlights. The hatch vanished under folds of dark canvas. Tarps fell like funeral shrouds over the hatch. The crowd gasped, voices tumbling into fearful whispers. The ridge smelled stronger than ever, the chemical bite lacing with the sour tang of damp earth. Daniel stood rooted, chest hollow. His land had been taken. His refuge had been violated. Even his wife's memory lay buried in the mud with the secret. And still, deep below, the ground pulsed once more like a warning no one wanted to hear. Daniel turned to leave, but the vibration shivered through his ribs again, harder this time, making him stumble. The secret wasn't finished with him. Then came the men who spoke in whispers. They arrived before dawn, their convoy muted, engines barely above a growl. Black SUVs slid up the ridge like shadows, headlights dimmed. By the time Daniel stepped onto his porch, they were already there, men in dark coats, boots sinking silently into the mud, speaking low into radios. Sheriff Cole stood with them, his posture stiff, his hat in his hands. He looked smaller now, deferential, as though he had ceded ownership of the forest entirely. Daniel approached, the cold biting his face. "Who are they?" he demanded. Cole didn't answer. One of the men in black turned instead, his eyes flat. "You should go back inside, Mr. Price. This isn't your concern anymore." Daniel's jaw tightened. "This is my land." The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Not tonight, it isn't." Daniel felt the words sink deep, heavier than threat, colder than law. He backed away, but his chest burned with anger that fought against his fear. Through the fog, he saw them work, floodlights re-erected, generators rumbling, a new perimeter built with razor wire instead of tape. The hatch remained hidden beneath tarps, but its presence pressed against the clearing like a heartbeat. Daniel lingered at the tree line, unwilling to return home, until a deputy barked at him to leave. He obeyed, retreating to his cabin, but the quiet there offered no safety. The walls still quivered with faint vibrations from the ridge. The smell had followed him, too chemical, sour, sharp enough to sting the back of his throat. He lit the fire, poured himself tea, tried to anchor himself in ritual. His wife's photo was gone now, swallowed by mud, and the absence clawed at him. He touched the empty spot on the table where it had rested for years, fingers trembling. Then the phone rang. The sound cracked the silence like a gunshot. Daniel nearly dropped his cup as he reached for the receiver. A voice hissed through the line, flat, unrecognizable. "Forget what you saw, or you won't wake again." The line clicked dead. Daniel's breath came fast, uneven. His knuckles whitened around the receiver. The fire popped, and for a moment he thought it was another gunshot. He slammed the phone down, heart racing. He paced the cabin, whispering to himself, fighting the urge to scream. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this." Then he froze. A shape at the window. For a moment he thought it was fog pressing too close. But then it shifted, solid, unmistakable, a figure standing outside. Daniel crept forward, pulse in his throat, and pulled back the curtain an inch. A shadow stood in the fog, a single ember burning like an eye, the crackle of its breath steady, too human to be the wind. Daniel stumbled back, heart hammering, until his spine struck the wall. He fumbled for his shotgun by the door, clutching it though his hands shook too violently to steady it. By the time he dared look again, the shadow was gone. Only fog clung to the glass, thick and impenetrable. He lowered the gun slowly, his chest aching. His knees threatened to buckle beneath him. The fire hissed low, and Daniel whispered into the empty cabin, "They won't let me out of this alive." The forest groaned faintly in answer, as though it agreed. The ember image burned in his mind, seared deeper than the chemical odor. Even if the hatch stayed sealed, Daniel knew now he was marked. Every shadow now felt like a watcher. Daniel moved through the next day like a hunted man. Every step outside his cabin felt exposed, every rustle of branches like a footfall behind him. The forest that once sheltered him had become hostile, its silence no longer peace but surveillance. The smell came first. It clung heavier now, even away from the ridge, sharp, chemical, sour enough to curl his stomach. The rain carried it down, seeping into soil, staining the air. Sometimes it was faint, like a match just struck. Other times it hit hard enough to sting his eyes, leaving him gasping. Then came the tremors. At noon, as he tried to split firewood, the ground shivered beneath him. The axe bit unevenly, sending the log toppling sideways. His arms trembled with more than fatigue. He dropped the axe, backing away as the earth beneath his boots quivered like a living thing. He whispered aloud, voice hoarse, "It's coming closer." That night, he woke to footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, crunching in the damp leaves. He sat frozen in bed, clutching the shotgun across his lap. The steps circled the cabin once, then again, then faded into the trees. When dawn came, he checked. No tracks, no prints, nothing but fog curling against the porch posts. By evening, the pressure broke him. He stormed into town, mud streaked on his boots, eyes wild with exhaustion. He shoved into the sheriff's office, startling the deputy at the desk. "Where's Cole?" Daniel rasped. Moments later, Sheriff Cole emerged from the back, hat in hand, his expression practiced calm. "Daniel, you look tired." Daniel slammed his fists on the desk, the sound cracking through the office. "If you won't protect us, then what are you protecting?" For the first time, the sheriff flinched. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicked toward the door as though to check who might be listening. Then his mask slid back in place. "You need to go home. Let us handle this." Daniel leaned closer, his voice trembling with rage. "You know damn well this isn't being handled. It's being buried." Cole's lips pressed into a thin line. His silence screamed louder than denial. Daniel staggered back, chest heaving. His anger burned hotter than his fear, but the mix left him shaking. He shoved out of the office, the deputy's eyes following him with something between pity and dread. That night, the pressure closed tighter. As he sat in his cabin, shotgun across his knees, the smell poured stronger through the cracks in the walls. His eyes watered, his chest ached. The ground shivered so hard the lamp rattled, the photo frame on the table falling flat again. Daniel whispered into the firelight, voice raw. "What do you want from me?" The forest groaned back. Outside, The fog thickened until it pressed against the windows like flesh. For a moment, Daniel thought he saw a figure again just at the edge, barely formed. The ember glow was gone this time, but the shape lingered too steady to be illusion. He dropped the curtain, heart hammering, and sank into his chair. Sleep came in jagged bursts, broken by the thumps that shook his walls. Each one felt closer, sharper, heavier, until he no longer knew whether they came from the hatch or from men pacing outside. By dawn, Daniel's eyes were hollow. His reflection in the window looked like a stranger, haunted and gaunt. He whispered to that reflection, "I can't outlast this. I can only survive it." And still the smell clung, sour and sharp, as though the forest itself were bleeding chemicals into the air. If this happened to you, what would you do? As Daniel stepped outside for air, the ground jolted hard enough to rattle the porch posts, and in the distance, faint but certain, a voice carried on the fog calling his name. And then the last secret broke free. Daniel stumbled back into town, drawn by desperation more than choice. He needed answers, not whispers. He needed someone to say the fear clawing at his chest was only in his head. But as he walked the muddy main street, he saw it in every face. People turned away too quickly. Conversations snapped shut when he neared. The whole town seemed to hold a truth just out of his reach. He found Sheriff Cole outside the diner, hat low, cigarette glowing. Daniel's voice tore raw from his throat. "You've known all along." Cole didn't deny it. He exhaled slowly, smoke curling into the cold air. "Some things are better left sealed." Daniel's fists clenched. Better for who? The sheriff's gaze flicked to him, tired and grim. Better for everyone still breathing. The words slammed into Daniel like a fist. His rage surged, but beneath it churned something heavier betrayal. He had trusted Cole, once, trusted him to protect this town, to guard the line between order and chaos. Now he saw only a man complicit, weighed down by secrets older than either of them. "I kept you safe by lying," Cole said quietly, almost as if it hurt him. "Better you hate me than vanish like the others." The others. Daniel's breath caught. What others? Cole's jaw tightened, but his silence screamed the answer. Daniel's chest hollowed. His voice shook. "I hated him, but fear sat heavier than hate. Fear pressed heavier, crushing my chest harder than hate could ever dream." The sheriff dropped his cigarette, grinding it into the mud. His hand brushed Daniel's shoulder, heavy and brief, before he walked away. Daniel stood trembling, the weight of those half-spoken words rooting him in place. A whisper broke behind him. We all knew. Daniel spun. Jack Whitmore stood there, shotgun slung but hands steady. His face carried no triumph, no smirk, only the dull heaviness of guilt. "You knew?" Daniel rasped. Jack's eyes shifted to the fog curling along the street. Not the details, not the crates, but we knew something was buried. Always did. Our fathers warned us not to dig too deep. Daniel's knees weakened. His neighbors, his friends, even the families he'd shared Sunday dinners with, all of them had known, and he had been left in the dark. Why didn't anyone tell me? Jack's voice cracked. Because knowing doesn't save you. It only marks you. Daniel's throat burned with fury and despair. He staggered away, the town pressing in silent on all sides. Doors half shut, curtains trembling, eyes that looked but would not meet his. The hatch no longer felt like an intruder. It felt like the heart of the town, a buried truth everyone had chosen to live beside. Everyone but him. That night he returned to the ridge. The tarp still smothered the hatch, weighed with chains and sandbags, but the ground throbbed faint beneath. Each vibration traveled through his boots, through his bones. Daniel sank to his knees in the mud, the chemical odor sharp enough to sting tears from his eyes. He pressed his palms flat against the earth, whispering through clenched teeth, "Tell me what you are." The soil shuddered, groaned, as though amused. And in that moment, Daniel realized the betrayal wasn't only the sheriff's. It was the town's. Generations of silence, a conspiracy of neighbors, all content to live above a secret so long as it stayed buried. But now it was no longer buried. Daniel looked at the tarps shivering in the fog, chains rattling faintly, and he knew with sudden clarity. The hatch was not the end. It was the beginning, and the town had only been keeping it quiet, not keeping it contained. But some secrets never truly stay buried. In the weeks that followed, Daniel hardly left his cabin. The ridge no longer belonged to him, fenced off with razor wire and patrolled by men whose names no one spoke aloud. Trucks came and went at odd hours, their headlights crawling across his walls. The hatch disappeared from sight. smothered beneath layers of tarps, then heavier coverings. But its presence throbbed still, pulsing through the soil, humming in Daniel's chest when he lay awake at night. He tried to hold on to normal things, splitting wood, brewing tea, polishing his old ranger's knife. But every action felt hollow. The photo of his wife was gone, swallowed by mud, and without it the cabin felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for something inevitable. Neighbors avoided him. At the diner, conversation stopped the moment he stepped inside. Mrs. Keller crossed herself each time he passed. Even Jack, once quick to wave, now only nodded stiffly from a distance, his eyes carrying the weight of shared guilt he no longer wanted to face. Daniel's world shrank to the cabin, the fog, and the faint quakes that rolled through the soil like muffled heartbeats. One evening, rain swept across the valley, drumming against the roof and pouring down the gutters. Daniel sat by the fire, shotgun across his lap, staring at the empty table where the photo once rested. His mind drifted to his wife, her laughter, her hand on his shoulder, her words. Forests keep more secrets than people do. He whispered into the crackling silence. You were right, but I dug anyway. The fire snapped, sparks spiraling up the chimney. Outside, thunder rolled across the ridge, and beneath it, faint but certain, came a groan from the earth. Daniel closed his eyes. He no longer told himself it was imagination. The next morning, he walked to the perimeter of the fence. Men in black stood guard, their eyes hidden by sunglasses despite the gray sky. He lingered until one barked for him to move on. He obeyed, but slowly, dragging his boots through the wet soil, making them know he hadn't left willingly. Back at the cabin, he sat with his journal, a habit he had abandoned years ago. His handwriting shook as he scribbled the words, If I disappear, it's because I knew too much. If they bury me, it will be in the same soil that still breathes beneath us. He stared at the sentence until the ink blurred. Then he tore the page free, tucked it beneath the floorboard where he had once hidden spare ammunition. A secret of his own, waiting for someone else foolish enough to find it. That night, the rain returned. It hammered the roof, pounded the earth, ran in rivers down the slope toward the ridge. Daniel sat on the porch, drenched, his shotgun resting across his knees. The smell came first, sour, chemical, sharp. It rose with the storm, stronger than ever, coating the air until his throat burned. Then came the vibration. He felt it in the wood beneath him, a shiver that built into a tremor. The forest groaned, not with wind or water, but with something deeper, older. Daniel clutched the gun tighter, though he knew it was useless. His chest ached with a truth he could no longer deny. He was no longer guarding his land. He was standing watch over something that had always been there, patient, waiting. By dawn, the storm had passed. The air hung heavy and still. Daniel rose, joints aching, and stepped inside. He lit a candle at the empty table where his wife's photo had once stood. The flame flickered weakly, trembling with every faint vibration beneath the cabin. He whispered, "This is all I can do for you now." And for the first time in weeks, a tear cut down his cheek. The town moved on, at least on the surface. The diner buzzed again, though no one spoke of the ridge. Children rode bikes past his cabin, but never lingered. Men in black came less often, though the fence remained. Reporters left. The story faded. The valley seemed ordinary again. But Daniel knew better. On damp nights, the smell still drifted through the air, sharp enough to turn heads. On rainy mornings, fog clung too close to the ground, shrouding the ridge like a wound that refused to heal. And in the silence afterward, people whispered. They whispered at church, in the diner, in the hardware store. Whispers of a hatch no one was allowed to see. Whispers of a secret meant to stay buried. No one asked Daniel anymore. No one needed to. He had become part of the story, an unwilling keeper, living on the edge of a secret no shovel could ever bury again. Daniel never slept easily again. His forest no longer felt like refuge, but like a graveyard of truths no man should touch. Locals still spoke in low voices about the hatch. Children dared each other to sneak near the fence. Some swore they still smelled the chemicals after rain. Others claimed the fog itself carried whispers. Even today, after the rain, the smell still rises sharp, sour, and too alive to be natural.